So we are back with another episode of After Dark, and, throughout this series, we've talked about a lot of screwed up things, but I think the topic that I have for you now is one of the most, if not the most disturbing thing I've ever heard. And I've told you before that I think the scariest stories are those that are true. And just like previous After Dark videos, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a fantasy. This is a fact. It really happened. This is the story of Operation Northwoods and Operation Mongoose. So, what if you're reading a story about a major news event? Or what if you're actually watching it play out on live TV with news anchors and everything? Have you ever stopped to consider that maybe what you're seeing may not actually even be real? Or at least real in the sense that things are happening in the way that they are being presented. What if it were all just an elaborate illusion to make you believe? What if you witnessed a terror attack on your own country's soil, and your government told you hours later that it was carried out by a rogue nation, and they provided evidence to support that? Most people wouldn't bat an eye or think twice about it. But what if it was your own government that had carried out that terrorist attack, and they did it in a way to make it appear as though it was done by an enemy? Now, many of you are probably thinking that that sounds completely absurd. That would never happen, at least in the civilized world. That the U.S. government would not even for a moment even consider carrying out terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. But you should be terrified to know just how wrong you are. Not that long ago, top military officials in the U.S., the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, got together and signed off on a plan. A plan whose ultimate goal was to start a full-on invasion, a war with Cuba. And they were willing to do pretty much anything in order to make it happen. But you can't go to war without a good reason. And they couldn't go to war without support of the allies across the world or without the support of the American people. So they were willing to stage a number of false flag attacks. Now, a false flag attack is where covert operations are carried out and designed in such a way so that it appears that it's being carried out by another group or another country other than the one who actually planned and executed it. What it boils down to is the U.S. government was going to use the CIA to plan attacks on the U.S. just so they could blame Cuba. And the goal was to get the world and the U.S. citizens on board and make it appear as though Cuba was the aggressor and the U.S. had justification for launching a counterattack and invasion. And what better way to drum up support for a war than to make the American people think they're under attack? So here are just some of the plans that they had detailed that they were willing to carry out. They mentioned having friendly Cubans in uniforms attack a U.S. military installation, blowing up ammunitions inside a base, or destroying aircraft, lobbing mortar shells from outside the base into a U.S. military base, attacking U.S. warships to sink it. They even talk about carrying out mock funerals for the media. The document discusses how they could blow up drones or whatever else they wanted in Cuban waters, and then when the Cubans came with like aircraft, for instance, to investigate it, they would use that as evidence that Cuba was the aggressor, that they were in the area when this moment took place. It talks about sending in rescue crews to evacuate non-existing personnel and how publishing a long list of casualties in newspapers would be helpful in drumming up support. They talk about sinking a boatload of Cubans coming into Florida, and they say it can be either real or simulated. So, while some of these mention, mock funerals and non-existing personnel, There's definitely some of these cases where they were like, you know what? If we need to kill people, we'll do it. And if you think attacking your own military bases was the tipping point of crazy, it gets a whole lot worse. The Northwoods documents also proposes starting terror campaigns in Florida and other cities, even Washington, D.C., having exploding plastic bombs located in strategic areas. And soon after the bombs went off, they would go and arrest so-called Cuban agents and release documents to the media that would show it was Cuba behind it all. Keep in mind, this was all okayed by the top military brass in the U.S. government. Another plan talked about how they could have a plane loaded with college-age kids who were actually CIA agents. They would take off from Florida and have a flight plan that went over Cuba. The CIA would create a plane that made it look identical, an exact replica, and that plane would be a drone. So it would have nobody on board. So what would happen is the plane full of agents would leave, and they would make sure that the media was there to film them leaving. Then, as they took off, the plane would then be diverted and land at a local Air Force base. The drone then, the one that's made to look like an exact replica, would continue the pre-made flight plan. And when it was over Cuba, a radio on board would begin transmitting on international radio waves that it was being shot at by a Cuban fighter jet. And then, by remote detonation, it would be blown up by somebody on the ground. Another plan talked about how they could claim that a U.S. Air Force jet had been shot down off the coast of Cuba in an unprovoked attack. Now, at the time that this attack supposedly took place, they were going to have a submarine in the ocean release materials to the surface, like jet parts and parachutes, to make it look as if a jet had just been blown up. Then they would send in their rescue teams who wouldn't have a clue that this was all fake or an illusion, and it talks about having them come on scene and they would believe that a fighter jet was actually taken out of the sky because they would find the wreckage. So not only are they willing to trick the American public, but they're also willing to trick the military. And it's also worth pointing out that this document, which I'll leave links to so you can go see it for yourself, this isn't something that was just pulled up on somebody's blog. This was reported by CNN, ABC, all the major news media. I mean, it's nothing that's like been hidden from view. The JFK Library actually put this out. It points out that it should not be forwarded, and then it lists a whole list of different military departments that they did not want to see this plan. So when people act like, they laugh off the possibility of some conspiracy actually taking place, they always say too many people would have to be in on it. Somebody would know, somebody would talk. No. There may be a lot of people involved, but most of them are just pawns. They don't even know that they're playing a role in an illusion. Very few people would know the overall plan. And if something like this were carried out, you'd have servicemen and women show up on scene. They could come back and report back to the media, I saw it with my own eyes. There's jet parts out there in the ocean. There was even a plan, because NASA was getting to launch John Glenn into space. They mentioned if something ends up going wrong with the rocket and it blows up, they could manufacture evidence to suggest it was Cuba. And again, this was signed off by the Joint Chief of Staff and made its way all the way to the Secretary of Defense and John F. Kennedy, who ultimately rejected the plan. So as far as the U.S.'s official stance is concerned, they say, look, these documents are out there, but they were never carried out. But the very fact that this made it to the President of the United States is what's mind-blowing. And who knows what could have happened if you would have had somebody in the president's seat who was okay with doing something like this. Or what if it was rogue elements within the government who didn't need to ask the president for an okay. And knowing that this wasn't done that long ago, because I mean, think about it. Cuba and U.S. relations are still broken. I mean, they're starting to get a little bit better, starting this year and last year, but they're still not normal. This was not that long ago. And you're telling me that only crazy people are supposed to think that this could happen again in the future? Or that it hasn't happened in the past? You know, anytime I talk about government surveillance and stuff like that, there's always a group full of people who stand up and they're toting the government line. They're like, why should you not believe the government? But my question is, why is it that you just blindly believe the government? Government is nothing but people. And if you haven't noticed, some people are pretty screwed up in the head. So, not everything is conspiracy. But it's not the conspiracy theorists who are crazy anytime that they question something. It's the people who believe that conspiracies never happen that are the crazies. That does it for me, the Red Dragon. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.